Today, we're really lucky to be joined by Jack Imhof. Jack is a former head national biologist for Trout Unlimited Canada, now works with some smaller chapters of Trout Unlimited as well, but a really great resource in our own backyard, who knows our waters and our trout fisheries specifically, probably better than most. So Jack, thanks for coming on.
You're very welcome, Chris. I'm very pleased to be here and happy to chat about brook trout.
Terrific.
I will take it away. So one of the talk I was going to give this evening, talking a little bit about brook trout in Ontario, especially brook trout in southern Ontario, where most of us live. But I didn't want to spread it out to show a little bit about what the status is elsewhere. So the general overview is going to be just a general discussion about what's been happening and the attitudes that people have. I'll talk a little bit about historical conditions, using the credit as an example, as well as current conditions, why we're seeing such losses of brook trout, and we have seen a lot of losses. And then I'll talk about tools and restoration work. And finally, asking a simple question is, who's minding the store? Which, given the fact that what Chris didn't mention, because I didn't mention it to him, is I also spent 30 years as an aquatic ecologist and restoration specialist with the Ministry of Natural Resources. And my specialty was watershed science, watershed restoration, and so on. So I've got a long history of working on streams in southern Ontario. I'll be talking a little bit about that. So we have a challenge. Doesn't matter where you are, the biggest problem is us. And there's more of us. And we have a tendency not to care in many cases what we do. And that's why I love this. I'm an old guy, so I remember even as a young kid, there was still a cartoon called Pogo around, and he was looking at litter in a forest, and he said, "We have met the enemy, and he is us." There is an issue there. The other thing I just want to mention is that we know what not to do. We just decide to forget. Every 20, 30 years, we forget, and we go back 50 years and try to reassess the situation. But this is a cartoon from 1947 from something called the Carling Conservation Digest, which was a magazine put out by Carling O'Keefe, because sportsmen were the #1 buyer of beer back in the 40s and 50s, and probably still are today. And it shows a little creek, beautiful little creek. Let's pretend it's even like Blair Creek near Kitchener. 1872, there's beautiful forest. The stream is nice and tight, clear flowing. The little dicky birds around, fish jumping. And a young lad has got a nice stringer of brook trout he's taking home to fry up. That same young lad now is an old codger. It's 1947. He's talking to his grandson saying, "When I was your age, William, a sparkling stream flowed here." What you see is as a result of the destruction of the forests and the swamps. It's not as though we don't know cause and effect. We do know what actions cause problems, even more so now, 50 years ago. We just decide to forget. And my little soapbox right now is, if anybody in this particular Ontario government talks about red tape, 99% of the time they're talking about environmental regulations. Just I'll let you know what they're really going after. Anyway, brook trout, the fish of the springs and the cold water streams. They require cold temperatures, as most of us that fish for them know, gently changing flow volumes, food, shelter, cover. They require groundwater discharge areas in order to reproduce successfully. The groundwater, of course, keeps them cold. And it keeps them cold because they're really not even a trout. They're a char, member of the Arctic char family. It's like lake trout, bull trout, gully barden, and of course, the brook trout. They do require very cold water. We used to have a lot of cold water. And they require that groundwater seepage in order to incubate their eggs successfully. And because that maintains uniform water temperature. And actually, even though they spawn later in many cases than other trout species like brown trout, they actually emerge a bit earlier because the groundwater stays at a uniform 6 to 8 degrees centigrade all through the winter, whereas the other fish that have their eggs in the gravel in the fall have to live with ambient stream temperatures close to zero. So of course they can reproduce and come out faster and sooner. When brook trout disappear, they're not just associated with their actual physical stream because they require groundwater so much. And the groundwater is usually not recharging right beside the stream. Quite often the groundwater they're using is recharging many kilometers away from the actual area where it comes out. As a result, they truly are citizens of the watershed. And when you start to see them disappear, quite often it means your groundwater resources are at risk, which also means water supply and everything else for people. So they truly are the canary in the coal mine when it comes to watershed health. So what is the current status of populations in Ontario? I was one of the folks that instigated a major science and management synthesis that the Ministry of Natural Resources coordinated back in 2017. And we basically brought biologists and specialists from across the province together in one place to have a conversation about the status of brook trout in Ontario. Now, brook trout populations are predominantly found in fishery management zones 6, 7, 8, 10, 15, 16, and 17. 15, 16, 17 primarily are south of Algonquin Park, central southern Ontario, and southwestern Ontario. That's the southern part of Ontario. The others are around the sort of the near north, Algoma, Nipigon, north of Superior, that sort of stuff. So those are the locations that are predominantly have the major brook trout populations. One of the things we asked the biologists to do, who came to the conference, was we asked them to go through all the records, not only written records and fish surveys and monitoring information, but also anecdotal information. We wanted to know what was the historical range of brook trout in your region, what is its current status right now, roughly. So we came up with that, and this is what we found out. We lost 20% of our brook trout populations in Northern Ontario, and likely over 80% in fishery management zones 15, 16, and 17 over the last 60 to 70 years. And we're still losing them. So in some cases, not all, everywhere, but in some locations, we certainly are losing them faster than we had before. So the question then is, why are the losses, especially in Southern Ontario? Well, let's go through them, and I'll start perhaps by looking first of all at Northern Ontario. So some of the major impacts on brook trout population losses in Northern Ontario are related to timber harvest, major impacts from roads or culverts, which reduce the ability of the animals to move upstream into healthier areas. Also sediment loads, mass amounts of sediment come off these roads if they're not designed properly, and a lot of them aren't. Mining, which also puts waste rock and acid drainage into a lot of water courses, either by accident or by neglect. So highway and rail corridors. As a matter of fact, we lost most of our coastal brook trout populations along the North Shore of Superior because of the building of the rail line along the shoreline. Vast majority of the streams across that rail, go underneath that rail line, are perched now because the rail system hanging culverts on all those locations. So the fish can go down, they can't come back. So that's an easy fix. If we ever wanted to find some money to do that, that's a fix. But we also have hydroelectric production, which has dammed a lot of those rivers and creates variable flows. Many cases not suitable not only for brook trout, but for lake sturgeon, walleye, and other species that utilize those large northern rivers. So what are the mechanisms of loss? Well, the one big one is what I call loss of connectivity. That is the ability of these animals to move not only up and downstream, but laterally into tributaries and back out again. Any of that is exacerbated by properly designed culverts, small dams, large dams, and so on. And that prevents critical movement of these animals, not only perhaps the ability to move out of a small stream when it gets a bit too warm in the summer into the big lake, but also going back into for reproduction or to escape high temperatures or other conditions. The sediment loads are really nasty because, of course, the one thing they do is follow up spawning areas. They also reduce bug density. Basically the food source of the fish, because fine sediment imbricates. That means it goes into all that beautiful gravel and cobble that we love at those northern rivers. reduces the total living space for those bugs, which means you reduce biomass, which means you have less bugs, which means you have fewer fish. And also they damage the health of the channel, because channels are designed themselves to move water and sediment during high flows. And if there's more sediment than they historically were able to handle, they tend to fill in and widen out and shallow out. So those are some of the issues that we deal with there. Also, the damage to the riparian area, the area adjacent to the stream, is critically important as well. And that can create a major problem. How far may brook trout move in a season or over a lifetime? Well, it depends. By the way, if you ask a biologist a direct question, the answer is usually it depends. But anyway, how far will they move? Well, some of them are home bodies and won't move very far at all. However, in case of, let me rephrase that. All brook trout have the potential to move great distances if the conditions warrant it. Whether you're a salter on the East Coast that moves out of streams when they get a bit warm on PEI or in New Brunswick or Nova Scotia or Newfoundland, and then they go along the coastline, shoreline for many, many, many kilometers and then move back into the streams during spawning season. Same with coasters on Lake Superior. We also have fish that'll live in the streams, but then move out into the lake in the summer and then come back into the streams that spawn in the fall, just like we have in some of the Muskoka streams as well. How far will they move? Some of them may move a few hundred meters in a day or two. A lot of them will stay put. Some will maybe move a kilometer or two. So it depends. I know when we did brown trout studies on the credit, that was done by a lad for his master's. He had 38 or 40 telemetry tags on large brown trout in the upper credit. And he found that some of them were home bodies that just didn't move at all. And others would move 5-6 kilometers in a night foraging, stay someplace else for a few days, and then come back to their home territory a few days later, and then stay put for a few weeks. So these animals historically moved around a great deal, more than we thought. And as we get telemetry tags that we can stick into fish and monitor their movements, we find that as the tags get smaller and smaller, and we put them in the various fish species that are small, we find that they move around a lot more than we ever thought they would. So my default is they probably move around a lot more than you think. Okay? That's a long-winded answer to it depends. So going back to damage, so the riparian areas are damaged quite often. That also, I sometimes call the riparian areas, and the vegetation on the sides of the streams are the bookends to the stream. If the bookends are damaged, the stream widens out and shallows out. You lose definition and health of the channel. You also lose water, you lose shading, you also lose bugs and that sort of stuff. So you have a variety of things can occur from that, from losing of the riparian area. And let's check here. Let's check. Why aren't you moving? Okay. There we go. And finally, hydroelectric development. Again, dams are what I technically call them discontinuities. They create barriers to movement. And that's not just the big dams, but small dams, online ponds too. They also affect water flow, and they also sediment starve the streams down below them because they capture sediment in the dam, and that doesn't pass through the dam. And ultimately, and of course, there's always overharvest. Some areas, especially, you can knock them back by by damaging the habitat. Quite often, what finally does them over is the overharvest of the few fish that are remaining. But quite often, it's a combination of things that affects the population of fish, no matter whether you're in north or south. So in southern Ontario, some of the major disruptions are traditional agriculture activities. And don't get me wrong, I like to eat. I have a lot of admiration for farmers and the hard work that they do to produce crops for all of us. But we can do better. And I know farmers that have done much better. And a lot of them don't do better. I don't know why. Maybe it just needed more incentives. And by the way, we eliminated most of the agricultural incentive programs 10 years ago. Another little thing one can do in government to improve farming practices, which we don't do anymore. So traditional agricultural activities, non-traditional agricultural activities, by that is different types of crops are now being grown as well and have an impact. We have point source pollution. For example, wastewater treatment plants discharge treated effluent, may have high levels of nutrients in it, also pharmaceutical, dissolved pharmaceuticals in them, which can also affect the fish. Then there's land use change and land use and urbanization, aggregate extraction and quarrying can have an impact. And of course, people's favorite, everybody loves a reflective surface. Anybody that buys a stream wants to put a dam on it, make a pond. Why don't they buy a lake, buy beside a lake instead of having to dam a stream? I don't know, but that creates discontinuities. In fact, water temperature, flow patterns, connectivity, all that sort of stuff.
I've always thought those people must really love mosquitoes too.
Yeah, the mosquitoes are a good bet, and also they also want to have to maintain it, because over time those ponds will fill in, because if they're on stream, that means the natural sediment load of the stream will not stop. It'll just gather in the pond, and eventually it'll fill it up, and then they'll have to dredge it. And then also, most of them don't realize that we have dam safety regulations under the Lakes and Rivers Improvement Act, and they can be charged if they don't maintain their dam in proper working order. So there's a lot of things that a lot of folks don't know. Now, what I want to show you is just this is based from the Conservation Success Index analysis we did with M&R, the CVC, trying to look at better ways of understanding what was happening on watersheds. And we used the credit. We've also done this on Brawny and 16 Mile Creek as well. But anyway, this shows the credit. This is based upon the best historical information we have going back in the 1800s. Green is where we potentially had distribution of brook trout. That was for the 1800s as an example. If you own property, quick question, does somebody say, if you own property on a river, are you allowed to dam it? Short answer, no. But there is a possibility. You have to go through the Lakes and Rivers Improvement Act, which means you have to demonstrate a justification for it. You have to put in plans, so on. They are reviewed, and if it's in its infinite wisdom, if M&R decides that this is reasonable, then you can build your dam. Most times the answer is no. As a matter of fact, M&R has been looking to try to remove more dams than allow them to be built. There are still folks that it's the old adage, it's better to ask for forgiveness than to beg for better to beg for forgiveness than ask for permission. A lot of folks will just do it, and a lot of people have been charged for that. A lot of them, very heavy fines, but sometimes you miss them. The old district, Owen Sound District Office, the COs used to fly their district at least twice a year just to look at illegal activity, and then go after those folks. So unfortunately, don't do that anymore, and there's hardly any staff to do any of that stuff anymore. We'll get into that. Non-traditional, well, it's anything that that's adjacent to streams, everything from ginseng and other types of crops. Marijuana production now is legal, and as a result, it all depends on how they manage the nutrient load off their farm fields, and whether or not they're getting runoff with all the nutrients that they put on. So that's what I meant by that. It's the traditional and non-traditional ones. Traditional are, of course, beans, corn, soy, those sort of things. Okay, so anyway, I just wanted to carry on with the credit. So that was mid 1800s, as best of our knowledge. By the 50s, when we did the province did a major review of their watersheds in the 50s. Let's see if will it go back here. That's what the status was at the time. At the 50s, we'd lost everything in the Peel Plain because we had taken the cedar forest out along the streams, and the humic soil under those cedar forests was a meter deep or more. And so even though it was on clay, you had a meter of humic and deep forest that actually filtered surface water and discharged it almost like groundwater, keeping the credit cool almost all the way down to is now present-day Mississauga. Wipe that out with agriculture. We needed the agriculture, so there you go. One outlier here is they never did monitor and survey Black and Silver Creek outside of Georgetown, so that's why it's in red. That was corrected a few years later by M&R when they did their surveys in the 60s and early 70s. And that in the 60s, early 70s, this was the distribution to our best of our knowledge of brook trout. Still a fair bit there. Now, the most recent studies have been done by the Credit Valley Conservation Authority that have 35 or 40 stations on the upper Credit. And this is the status now. So there's from about 25, 30 years ago, and that's 5 years ago. So right now we have Black Creek, Georgetown, and we have the West Credit. And by the way, Aaron is right about Aaron soon to put their new wastewater treatment plant up, and probably another 2,000 or 3,000 homes close to the stream. So the health fountain's not happy. I wouldn't be happy. I am not happy. But anyway, that's politics. So anyway, that's some of the things that have happened on the Credit. What's happened on the Credit has been mirrored a mirror for so many other watersheds in Southern Ontario. It's not as though we don't know how to plan better and design better. We just may not do so. Okay. So what are the mechanisms driving population loss in the South? Just to be specific, again, sediment, inputs, and habitat loss, runoff from farm fields and urban development, major impacts on channel health and habitat. You go to far northern Ontario and it rains like hell. Rivers come up, they go a little bit brown stained, then they come down. Down and around here, when you see a modest heavy rain, our streams go totally brown, and that's surface runoff. So we've eliminated the sponges. We could put them back if we want. It may mean putting a riparian area that's wider and working with farmers to get no tillage practices and that sort of thing, but we don't tend to do that right now. Also, the increase in what's called impervious surfaces. What's an impervious surface? Well, concrete, asphalt, houses with roofs, that's impervious. That means it doesn't allow water to infiltrate into the surrounding landscape and groundwater. So we have a lot more impervious surfaces as we grow and build. And that, which means loss of groundwater, which means more surface water to get rid of, which means discharging into your local creek more quickly than ever before. And then there's drainage and agricultural drain maintenance. And it's not as though we don't know how to design an agricultural drain to emulate a natural channel. It's just that we've always done it a certain way, and it's pretty hard to change practices, and they want you to prove there's alternatives, which we have. Then they say, well, we want somebody to give us more money so we can design them the way you suggest is better. So the short term, it costs us more money, and the long term, it would cost everybody less money, and you'd have trout and other fish species. But so far, that battle has not been won. And then there's overall changes in water quality and quantity, extensive and intensive use of fertilizers. We're into the zone now where we use a hell of a lot of fertilizer, including on urban lawns, and that stuff. We usually, a farmer will tell you that they're probably much better than an urbanite in how much fertilizer they put on a hectare of land, and they're right. Urbanites have a tendency to put 2 to 3 to 5 times as much fertilizer on a piece of land than a farmer would get the same result. The vast majority of that extra fertilizer is flushed off, goes into your storm drain, it's straight out into your creek, and makes green things grow. Unfortunately, the green things that grow is usually algae, which then dies, rots, and reduces the dissolved oxygen. So there are things one can do. Extensive use of fertilizers has been an issue. Also with farmers, a lot of them don't maintain high organic content in their soil, which capture and hold nitrogen better. So they have to put more nitrogen in because the soil structure is not as good as it used to be. And then there's the pesticides, and there's strong evidence that certain types and species of neonicotinoids do affect bugs. I call this a new silent spring because neonicotinoids became the dominant pesticide in the early 2000s. About 5-6 years later, the bird community started talking about far fewer swallows and other passerine birds, insect feeders found along streams. Well, the reason was there's fewer bugs. And when there's fewer bugs, there's not enough food for the birds, there's fewer birds. And that means the hatches are fewer, and especially where you have a lot of neonicotinoids coming in. So Europe has now banned 2 or 3 different types of neonicotinoids that have been directly identified as killing aquatic invertebrates, which then affects birds and fish and everything else. But we've been slow to act on that. It's not as though we can't do it, we just don't. So the other issues, of course, are sediment loss and habitat loss. As I said, around here, you get a modest amount of heavy rain and your streams go straight up very quickly and turn right down. And that's all that extra sediment going down and flushing down the system. The other issue we have right now, especially in agricultural areas, is that all that marginal land that a bunch of us urged farmers to retire 25, 30 years ago, because they would only maybe get one good crop over 2 to 3 years out of it. So really it wasn't worth it. We urged them to retire it, and we gave them a little bit of modest subsidy. They retired that land. Now they're looking and saying, geez, corn is 35, 40 bucks a bushel. A marginal land, even if it only produces a little bit of a crop every few years, I'm going to take it. So now they're eliminating a lot of the riparian areas we had reestablished and putting them into crop. It's funny how things go around. But anyway, so we do have that issue coming in, and of course, then trying to get the maximum amount of yield out of their crops. And anybody that's floated the Saugeen downstream of Walkerton has probably seen the corn falling into the stream as the banks are eroding, and that is absolutely ridiculous. But guys think that they're making an extra buck even though they're losing land, and of course everybody loses. The farmer loses and the river loses. The other element is that big economic push for land drainage, which is now increased again in areas that we thought were fully built from an agricultural drainage perspective, and that's been happening everywhere, even around here in Georgetown and north up towards Grand Valley. All new tile fields. By the way, you can have nice fields that are very productive. The heavier the equipment is, the more it compacts the soil. The more it compacts the soil, the less drainage you have. So then they have to put an agricultural drain and tiles in. If they use lighter equipment, which they can't use because they need bigger equipment to harvest bigger landscapes. So it's a sort of like a death spiral down. The bigger you get, the more you damage the environment, and the more you have to put more things into it to keep it healthy, your cropland. Somewhere along the ways, we need to think of a different paradigm. So the other element are temperature changes. For example, I can't see it very well. This little dark mass here are about 300 brook trout sitting on the upper Credit River during one hot summer day when the main temperature coming down here was 24 centigrade, and this little spring was coming in underneath that little log jam there. It's coming in at 14 degrees, and they were sitting in the slipstream of that cool water. That was a little cool water pod. That was their cold water refugia in that summer. So temperature increases have a major impact on brook trout because, again, they're cold water loving animals. And climate change is not going to help the situation, especially if we lose more groundwater. It won't offset climate change issues. And then finally is impervious surfaces, which can reduce groundwater recharge, increases flooding, and something I didn't think about years ago, but you get say a week or two of very, very hot weather, and all those roads and streets get really nice and hot. Then you have a heavy rain. Water coming off of that is hot. Storm water coming off of this, not cool storm water. It can be 25, almost 30 degrees centigrade coming into a cold water stream. You get thermal shock, you kill a lot of animals that way. So those sort of things happen as well. And then there's the road salt stuff and other stuff. So, our practices do bad things. We have, and there's lots of science on alternatives. It's just may cost a bit more, and we like to be cost effective. So we have to figure out what cost effective really means someday. And then we put all that water into these wonderful places like this concrete invert, which costs approximately, I think is last time I heard, it was like at $100 per linear meter. And they thought they'd last for 50 years. And then they discovered that these ones are starting to crack after 15, 20. So that's a very expensive fix to get water moving very, very quickly. And then you have that water moving way too fast into other water courses, which then creates other problems. So it's just like passing the buck downstream. And finally, there's that disruption of connectivity, much like we talked about before. So lots of problems. Lots of problems. There's a nice perch culvert there. And then the final blow is urbanization, with all the wonderful things that we do with it. And some of the key mechanisms to change with urbanization is increasing that imperviousness, stormwater management. For example, I had an argument with a really good friend of mine and good colleague about the wastewater treatment plant up in Erin. He said, well, yes, we're designed it so it potentially could quadruple the population. I said, over and above the sociological issues of growing too fast as a community, i.e. Hampton. He said the other issue is not just whether that wastewater is okay and the fish can handle it, the temperatures. I said, but that also means that you got 1,000 more houses being built, which means stormwater. So it's not just the wastewater treatment plant that's the issue, it's everything else that happens after that that'll affect the system. So that idea of stormwater is also very much. And also the issue of growing out versus up. For a while there, we said maybe we should intensify, and a lot of municipalities are trying to do that. But now, all of a sudden, we've decided that sprawl is great. Yeah. So we're seeing the green belt being built on. Hey, what the hell? Hey, it's call it affordable. And so there's all these issues going on right now. What are the consequences of all this stuff? Well, as I said before, water quality impacts, water quantity impacts, if channel changes. Oops, let's go back up there. What I want to say is all those things result in changes in nutrient cycling. Remember your old mathematics, that's just delta, which means change. So change in nutrient cycling, change in channel morphology, the structure of the channel, and how it evolves, changes in temperature regime, changes in habitat conditions, all that affect the animals, not just trout, but all the animals that live in these waters. And I put this together years ago because I was a cub leader. And I want the kids to know what the consequences of what happens when water falls from the sky onto the land. And so here's an example: agriculture or urbanization. You have those changes where you rip all the soil off the landscape, and you have that extra water you have to deal with. You put it into drains, and then it goes into natural channels, causes green things to grow. You have to sometimes armor the channel because it's blowing people's houses apart, or it just erodes the banks. A quick anecdote. I was talking to the farmer. He had his cattle grazing right on this lower right-hand corner stream. He was saying to me, God damn that tree, ready to fall in. I said, what's wrong with the tree? He said, look at it. It's way out in the stream. I said, I don't think the tree is way out in the stream. I said, the banks are way back from where they used to be. That poor tree is showing you how valuable roots are in holding banks in place, despite the fact you have cattle in the area. So it's all the consequences of mismanaging water on the landscape is summarized in a quick little image here. And then just finally, just as an example, when you change the various types of uses of land, you have funny things can happen. This is just a simple diagram I put. So the upper end is a natural system. You got these blue areas are not water. This is, I will call those aquitars. Let's say they're clay lenses on a landscape. And down here's bedrock. And then this is all gravel or cobble and these clay lenses. And here's water coming from the sky in certain areas where it goes down and then builds up a water table. And that water table flows down slope and then pops out and creates water beds for the brook trout. Water beds, groundwater upwellings. So that's all fine. Some areas it runs off and then it hits another little swale that's permeable and it goes into the ground. We put a house in here, we put a septic system and it leaches into the groundwater and it's impervious here. And then we have a well and that pulls the water table further down on the groundwater. And then we put a road here or some sort of surface and that prevents water from going into it. And over time, the water table diminishes to the point where it's not contributing any groundwater to the system. Virtually all of it is surface water. And that's what's happening in many parts of Southern Ontario. And that's one of the reasons why we're seeing all the changes we have in the last 60 to 80 years. So that urbanization is the final frontier. And there's a guy by the name of, I don't know how many of you guys have ever heard of, if you want to be a good conservationist, You really want to read Aldo Leopold's Sand County Almanac, especially the land ethic chapter. It was written in 1950, and it's still the Bible for those of us that are conservation minded, want to understand the principles of sound land and water conservation. Aldo Leopold. It's still in print. I think edition 85 or something ridiculous like that. But anyway, he talked. I met his son, who was a guy by the name of Luna Leopold. Funny name, Stalker Luna. Stalker was his other son. Luna was the modern day father of modern day fluvial geomorphology, which is the study of how rivers work. He was also a geoscientist, engineer, and a very interesting man. But I remember talking to him, and I said, well, here's what happens with urbanization. Build out, you have stormwater, you have a natural system that over time now you have all that extra stormwater going in. The river adjusts itself to handle more water. It does that by eroding out and down. Well, the trouble is, as you urbanize, all those properties on the side are owned by people. They don't want to see that property lost, so you armor the sides. Now you still have more stormwater coming in. The water wants to adjust a channel to handle all that extra water, so it starts cutting down and the sides start to fall in. What's the answer? Armor the bed. Now everything's armored. Everything's wonderful, except now you have all sorts of horrible situations to deal with downstream. So I said, did engineers get it all wrong 50, 60, 70 years ago when we did this type of approach? He said, well, what you're looking at is a logical progression of design based on a flawed premise. Oh, I wish I'd done more on philosophy, but flawed premise, that means the fundamental principle that you use to consider an issue and how to solve it is flawed. And the flaw was, we have to move all the water off the landscape as quickly as humanly possible. We asked the engineers to do that, and they did a great job of that, except it created all sorts of other problems that we're now dealing with. So you have to go back to first principles and redetermine how we manage water on the landscape, even with urbanization. And that's what we're trying to do. And there's been a lot of success with that, but again, government agencies don't really exist anymore that really push for that so far, except federal. So the wild card, of course, is climate change. Now, already we're playing a major part in exacerbating population losses through hotter, fire summers. Prediction for Southern Ontario 30 years ago with the modeling was we're going to get hotter, drier summers, we're going to get warmer, wetter winters, more variable precipitation, more extremes, higher variability. We're living it, man. We're living it, guys. And it's going to get worse. By the way, there's a 20-year lag. So even if we stop and peak our carbon emissions right now, it's going to get worse for 20 more years before it stabilizes and gets better. If we wait 20 years to fix this problem, we'll have 40 years to wait, and it'll be even worse, far worse. So it's wise to start thinking about solving that problem now. So despite all of that, what does all the analysis tell us about where we can expect to see brook trout persisting despite climate change? Not talking about human activities too much right now, but what are those areas? And a lot of this research was done by Dr. Mark Ridgway from the Harkness Lab up in Algonquin. He's an M&R research scientist, great guy, also good fly fisherman. And he basically said the areas that they modeled that should demonstrate that brookies will survive climate change as it stands right now are the Algonquin Highlands, Algonquin Park, Algoma Highlands, between Sault Ste. Marie towards the Ottawa border in that area there north of Georgian Bay, Nipigon Highlands, and potentially the gravel sand moraines, the Oak Ridge moraines around the Greenbelt and some of the escarpment areas, if we allow water to still go into the ground without destroying those recharge areas. You notice I didn't say the far north. I'll explain why in a moment. Here are some of the areas that I'm talking about as the major areas. And yes, of course, there's this zone through here as well, although the highest quality and productivity is up here, this area here, this area here, and along the Oak Ridge Moraine Escarpment and down through here, the Norfolk Sandplain. So why not the far north? The only reason these north, like the Sutton River and all these, the Attawapiskat and all those beautiful rivers still have brook trout is not because there's a lot of groundwater, it's because the water stays cold. However, 6 to 8 years ago, they had a near brook trout die-off on the Sutton River. The temperatures, the summer temperatures are getting so warm in the far north that those cold lakes that feed all those rivers were getting too warm. And as a result of that, they're getting too warm for trout. It's because they're sitting on the big plain up there, right? This is all big flat peaty plain on clay up in that area, the uplands, those areas there. Once you get past the more tortured terrain of the Canadian Shield. Sorry about that. My God. Anyway, so that area, the Hudson Bay lowlands only have brook trout because the lakes are cold. Feed them. If the lakes warm up, you lose a brook trout. That's why the far north is not a good candidate for survival of brook trout. So in southern Ontario, we are blessed with having large moraines thanks to the last glacial epoch, which dropped huge amounts of gravels and sand. There's the gravel and sand deposits of the Oak Ridge Moraine, the Almonte Highlands up here, the Saugeen area. This is the glacial fluvial outwash of the Grand, then some of the areas of the Norfolk Sandplain. Those areas have deep deposits of gravel, sand, and sands, which allow for major infiltration. And at the bottom of those hills are cold water streams. So those are the areas where we find cold water streams. As a matter of fact, I wrote an article 10 years ago. I'm not sure if it's still posted somewhere on the internet, but I used to called the prospecting for trout, how you can use geology to figure out where your trout streams are. So that's why we still have them. We did a simple study on this. We looked at what's called coarse textured soils versus fine textured soils, coarse textured gravel, sands, and that sort of stuff with a certain depth, fine textured tills, clays. So the green are the fine textured tills and clays. The pale brown are the sort of the more coarse textured soils. And there's some variability, but you can see, and the red dots are brook trout populations that we knew at the time, 1990. You'll see the Oak Ridge Moraine here, the Saugeen, sort of Saugeen moraines here, Dante Highlands here, glacial fluvial outwash of the Grand, and the Norfolk Sandplain. We're outliers. So we thought, well, maybe the model is not that great. What's wrong with what's happening here? And what we found were every one of those dots is a large esker sitting on clay. It's a gravel esker sitting on clay. So it infiltrates water on top of the esker. What comes out of the bottom, cold, and has brook trout populations. So it tells you that you can have brook trout if you can keep those damn things infiltrating. And that's where the hope is for Southern Ontario, maintaining those areas of infiltration and not buggering them up by other means. Those moraines do absorb huge amounts of groundwater. Here's a highly dense area of moraine here. Here's another one here. And those are the two major areas of large populations of cold water stream coming out of them. This is geology, guys. It's not biology. It's geology driving biology in this case. So we can do better. We can demonstrate a lot of, we have done better. We just tend to forget. So one of the key things to remember is a guy by the name of James Lovelock, who wrote was coined the Gaia hypothesis. He was a research scientist, an eminent scientist, really interesting guy. But he really put it out in one of his books. He said, you know what, you guys, you environmentalists, we're not trying to save the planet. We're trying to save ourselves. If we really F up this planet really, really badly, and it'll wipe us out. It'll have climate change type of catastrophes. And in a few geological ages, the system will be back to health and very productive again. We won't be here. So really, guys, you can't really think we're trying to save ourselves over and above the fish that we love fish for. So what we need to do is try to restore, rehabilitate all that what I call natural infrastructure, our watersheds, our recharge areas, channel morphology, the stream corridors, wetland areas, we need to rebuild those because they create resilience and flexibility to handle higher climate variability, cool the water, they cleanse the water, they keep it cleaner, smoother, and more stable, which is good for us as well as the fish. And also to maintain our water supplies as well. Because we all need cool, clean water, wholesome food, whether you're a bug, a fish, or a human. And that comes from a healthy, functional watershed landscape, which we tend to over abuse in many cases. We do need the tools and on the ground work. So where are some of the examples of where we have seen some successes? Well, one of the big ones is the recovery and expansion of Nipigon Lake and Nipigon River brook trout populations. And that was to a large degree because of a guy by the name of Rob Swainson, an eminent biologist who in many ways and many times was threatened with being shipped off to Moosonee because he was a shit disturber and wanted to protect the brook trout of the Nipigon River. And he worked his ass off, worked with the anglers and locals of Nipigon Red Bay and with out of Thunder Bay, and convinced them that by reducing harvest and increasing and having a minimum size limit, they should be able to clean the Nipigon brook trout back. He also then went toe to toe with Ontario Hydro, was able to get them to moderate their flow patterns out of the Nipigon River. That combination of things had the Nipigon River population explode, and it's still building and growing. At the same time, that also then led to the beginning of the recovery of the coastal brook trout population out of Nipigon. The Nipigon River was the last great holdout of coastal brook trout in all of Lake Superior. By restoring the population of trout in the Nipigon River, he basically gave the chance for those animals to survive, move back out at the Nipigon Bay. Now those animals are out of Nipigon Bay and they're starting to reproduce in the tributaries up and down the shoreline where they have access. So the population is still growing. A friend of mine, Al Hassel, I think some of you know Al, the artist. He illustrates a lot of books and used to be one of the senior illustrators for Fly Fisherman magazine for the back page. But anyway, Al lives in Terrace Bay, and he said when he first moved up there 10, 15 years ago, there were no brook trout, coastal brook trout in Terrace Bay. You had to go into Nipigon Bay to find them, if you're lucky. And just in the last 10 years, he said it's now common to find coastal brook trout. And much of the young guys he fishes with, when they were growing up, never saw brook trout in Terrace Bay. Now they're common. Population is expanding. So that's a good news story. It started with one guy. So that's really. We're also looking at the testing of exceptional management approaches. There's a couple of guys out of the Blind River office and that have been working in Algoma, and they've established a number of special regulated areas and management areas in the Algoma Highlands. And those are becoming very successful in maintaining populations in Algoma. And
You still have it, Jack?
the Algonquin Provincial with your fish management players, and really, I'm sorry, we have a whole bunch of questions here.
Sorry, yeah, you had cut out there for a second.
Thanks for putting all. I can see that. Okay, thank you. And also putting up the notice about Leopold. Good. Oh, sorry. Yeah, got that. Okay, I think we're all good. Okay, I'll start again. The Algonquin Park is going through a major update to their fisheries management plan. There's an advisory council. I'm one of the people on that advisory council. We're working very closely with Ontario Parks, put a plan together to look at sustainability and the recovery of brook trout populations in Algonquin Park as well as lake trout. We want them as wild as possible and keep wildness of trout in the park. As my comment is, it's sort of like another guy, Paul Schullery, years ago wrote an article called "Trying to Create a Reasonable Illusion of Wildness." Let's face it, there's a lot of people that use Algonquin Park, but it still feels wild, and it is a wilderness experience, even though there are a lot of people. We've been able to maintain and manage the pressure in a way that maintains the population of animals that live in the park, especially the brook trout and the lake trout. And that's what this plan is designed for, is to create the sustainability for the long term for those populations. So that's a good news story. And finally, we've got the work that we've been doing in the South. A variety of organizations, not just Trout Unlimited, but many organizations have been working on trying to establish and restore a lot of cold water streams in the area. I would like to say that we're moving ahead in sort of gaining momentum, but some days it feels like one step forward and two steps back. We are gaining some locations here. So one of the things that we have done is Trout Unlimited worked with TUUS, did something called the Brook Trout Habitat Joint Venture a number of years ago in Appalachia. They worked with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, all the various states, and they used something called the Conservation Success Index as a method of summarizing information, landscape information on brook trout populations in Appalachia, right from Georgia all the way up to Maine. And they looked at ways for restoration. We utilized their model, modified it for Canadian data, and we tested it on the Credit and on a couple other watersheds in Southern Ontario. And this is just one tool that is available for anybody that wants to use it. And that produced a variety of maps on where we have the biggest chance for success in restoration and management of trout on the Credit, with the details of what needs to be done. And those reports now are with the ministry, as well as with the Credit Valley Conservation Authority and other organizations that are interested in working on the Credit. We were hoping to find money to do it on the Saugeen and other watersheds. We ran out of money, and so welcome to the world of not-for-profits. So anyway, the tool is there. We can crack it out and utilize it. There's also really good M&R scientists. One of the few groups of people that they haven't gotten rid of in government are some of the M&R scientists, and they're doing excellent work still. Trouble is there's nobody there to implement their ideas. So here's an example of some of the simple restoration work. This was done by the Speed Valley chapter of Trout Unlimited. They're doing restoration work on Marden Creek, which is the little creek that flows into Guelph through the Ignatius Jesuit Center there, just north of Highway 6. Used to be two ponds on either side of Highway 6 as you headed north out of Guelph. Now gone. That was my fault. Thank you. But they also did work further up. They removed other on-stream ponds. They found areas where there was upwelling, there was groundwater discharge, but not upwellings. They actually put a tile bed underneath stream, capture that groundwater, and pump it into the stream bed. And they got brook trout spawning in there successfully. So that plus a couple other projects they did have got the brookies now. So for the first time in 186 years, there are brook trout that can move all the way down Marden, the Speed River, and back up again and survive. So hopefully that's an example of a group doing a little bit of work on a small stream, but having big results. We also did a lot of work on a section of public water. This is Lowville Park, owned by Burlington. And this is the restoration work we did in trying to rebuild riffle pool sequence and tighten up the riparian zone. So this is after 2 or 3 years of our work, bioengineering work, to get that stream tighter and more functional. Ed Knott chapter has been trying to restore brook trout to a little stream called Mill Creek, not Mill Creek in Puslich, but Mill Creek flows into the Grand River near Tequania. And it has a lot of springs, icy cold springs. Kind of anoxic because they're deep water springs, but they get oxygen quite quickly. But the whole area was heavily agriculturalized to the point where there's no cold water animal anywhere. Stream temperatures consistently got over 28, almost 30 degrees in the summertime. They did 8 years of work working with farmers and landowners to the point now where that stream never gets above 20. Now, but they didn't have any brookies. So what did we do? Got to go donor populations, and you move wild fish with M&R from a donor stream into that stream to kickstart the brook trout population again. And this is the work they've done on the Black Creek. 3,000 hours of volunteer effort. After 7 years, we finally got these fish in there. Built some spawning habitat. In the fall of 2015 to 16, we put brook trout in those systems. Here's the source area. This is just the work. We were putting tags in, passive transducers, so we can monitor how well they did. Those are the little guys that we put into that creek. There's the release site, is a little secondary cold water trib coming in. And we basically put those wild fish in there. And I just want to say that as of November of that year, there were 6 to 7 reds. We put them in early October. They were already spawning by late November. And of the, I think the 20 fish that we put in, we were able to account for 19 the following spring. We survived the winter. So you can do things with good science, good information. Here's another stream that we worked on. This is up near the Markdale area. It was basically undersized culverts and old beaver activity, and the stream just basically filled in. So it was usually about 3 feet and then just slow down the temperature to the side and made it tighter. It rebuilt its pools and riffle sequence.
Sorry, Jack, I think we lost you again.
You still hear me? Is it still good, Chris?
Yeah, you're just coming through now.
It'll stay for a minute. So this is the restoration work on that particular. And we knew there were rookies in this team, but talked to the locals, and this guy said, "I stopped fishing it 30 years ago because there's nothing left." We saw a few fish. We couldn't even electrofish them because there was too much debris and there was too much loon shit. We thought there were a few fish around. So we thought we had a starter culture if we could just fix the habitat up. So we did. This is 5 years later. Here. 5 years later, I went back to the same section with a friend to take a look at it. At first, I thought, oh, look at, there's 1 or 2 nice brook trout there, little brookies feeding. And then I zoomed in further and realized there was a heck of a lot more brook trout in there. This is the old, if you build it, they will come approach to restoration. If you do the right job, the animals will respond. And these are wild fish. There's no stocking in the stream. This is all based on the fact that now they had better habitat and the population grew. So what's happened in the last few years? I mean, there's still good people doing good work, but where's the backup? Ultimately, the backup and the real heavy lifting used to be done by organizations like the Ministry of Natural Resources, with 26 districts, with every district having 2 to 3 to 4 biologists, plus technicians, plus COs. We had a workforce there that worked with the communities and tried to make sure good work was done. So what happened? Well, before the 80s and 90s, when I was working for M&R, I used to say that the 1900 to 1978, we were the hewers of wood, dammers of rivers, stalkers of fish, and catchers of poachers. That was what the lands and forests did. Starting in 79 through 95, we switched to a major science-based organization focusing on watersheds, wild fish, and habitat. Then something happened in 95. I think we elected a different type of government. And what happened since then is downsizing. When I started with the ministry in 1979, there were, with full-time and seasonal workers, 6,500 people working for M&R. By the time I left, retired from M&R in 2010, it was under 2,000. You can't get as much work when you don't have people. So major downsizing, and the downsizing slowed between early 2000s to late 2010, 2012, and then of course different government came in recently, and further downsizing. So my joke is that they told us back in the 90s to do more with less. By the mid 2000s, they told us to do something with nothing, and today they're saying do the minimum with no one. And that's a result of changes in government. So, question you got to ask yourselves, and if you love your fishing, much of the quality of fishing you have now is as a result of what we did in the late 80s through the late 90s. We've been living off of that momentum. It's slowing as a result of further downsizing and the loss of staff. I mean, Owen Sound District 15 years ago had 20 to 25 full-time staff. It has 2 now. That's just one district. Other districts are the same. All the districts in the south are the same. Even in the north, they've reduced it significantly. So the question I would ask, and maybe you should ask your local MPP, who's in charge of sound environmental resource management in Ontario? Because I don't know anymore. I'll say, oh, we have the Ministry of Natural Resources, the Ministry of Environment, but what are they actually doing compared to what they were doing 20 years ago? What agency is actually managing the critical indicators of health? I thought to myself, okay, if we really screw up M&R and really constrain the Ministry of Environment, at least conservation authorities are there to pick up the slack. Well, guess what? We've now constrained them significantly to the point where we're almost strangling them. So nobody is minding the shop, guys. And question, do they have the tools and staff to be on the ground? Well, they don't anymore. And are the non-government organizations expected to carry the torch? Well, most of the NGOs have anywhere from 5 to 15 full-time staff, and that's it per province. How can they take the place of hundreds of biologists, scientists, and planners that M&R and other agencies used to have who are on the ground all the time? The answer is you can't. You do the best they can. Interesting fact, just really kind of fun, is both the Ministry of Natural Resources and what is now called MECP combined have a budget of less than 0.5% of the total provincial budget combined. So now you know where the priority is. So if you worry about your fishing, you have to get up, do what I did when I was a young guy, as I got involved. I'm still involved. God help me. So, but nevertheless, getting involved. I mean, I love my fishing. I want to put something back and make sure that my grandkids, now I have grandkids, the grandkids can grow up and have a good fishing experience like I did. When I grew up, I couldn't even find a good place to go trout fishing in Southern Ontario, close to Kitchener. Now I can. And that's because of people at conservation authorities and local district M&R offices that work their asses off, bring things up to a certain level, but now they're not there, and a lot of the staff that used to be there are not there anymore. So we have a challenge. So the key takeaway is, if you want healthy environment, clean cold water, and as a result, brook trout, we need to rebuild effective government agencies whose task is to work with private interests, private sector, and needs to ensure the best outcomes for the environment. We used to have it. We have that model. It worked. We just forgot about it. And key is that governments now are so constrained that all that M&R can do is regulation. And I was an adjunct professor through the School of Planning at the University of Guelph for quite a few years. Aquatic ecologist in planning, who could figure that? Anyway, and one of the comments of the planners there was that regulation is your last recourse in sound environmental management, not the recourse. It's the worst recourse because it always allows for slippage and loss. The best recourse is stewardship and working with communities and landowners and others to do things better and providing a bit of seed money to help them do better. That's the best recourse. And regulation is there for the people that don't want to play nice and don't give a damn. And you have the stick. But when regulation is your only recourse, you lose. We're losing. So that's the takeaway. You need to demand better. Be vocal about it. The future's in your hand. I'm getting kind of old. I can't do this much longer. So I don't want to put it as a downer. We have successes. We can demonstrate we have success, which is telling us that this is not some voodoo science. This is stuff that we can do. We have to want to do it, which brings me to a little joke. The question is sort of how many psychiatrists does it take to change a light bulb? The answer is only one, but the light bulb really has to want to change. Guys, you really have to want change. All right, you ain't gonna have it. So, okay, Chris, that's it.
That's terrific. I don't take that as to be a downer at all. I think it's great, and I hope that people are encouraged to get out there because of this.
We have some of the finest. I fished all across the U.S., UK, South America, elsewhere. Our river systems in Southern Ontario are some of the most productive in the world if they're managed well. The only streams that I found that were even more productive than Southern Ontario streams were on PEI.
Interesting. Keep that one to ourselves.
Yeah, on the ground.
I feel like I know you said NGOs definitely aren't the be all and end all, and shouldn't carry that weight, but it is probably one of the easiest ways for average people to get involved, besides the voting machine and writing letters. I feel like some people are probably a little intimidated to reach out to groups like TU or Ontario Streams or whoever else. You want to describe the process briefly of how people can get involved?
Yeah, well, if you go to the Trout Unlimited Canada, tucanada.org website, go to chapters, you can find chapters close by with contact. Chapters are always looking for people who want to get involved. And it's also an educational thing, because if you don't know what the right thing to do is, most of these guys and gals are more than happy to work with you and bring you along, show you what they're doing, explain why, and get you involved. It's more so they want you more than you want them. So really, you can reach out to them that way. There's other great organizations that Ontario Streams does really good work. The OFAH has a number of their groups that do good work. Not all of them, but some of them that are do on the ground work. There are local groups that do good work. So search them out in your community and just talk to them.
Yeah, I know. Having participated with TU chapters in the past too, like everyone brings a skill of their own to the operation. You don't have to be a biologist to be a part of these things, and you don't just have to be a helping hand planting trees, as great as that is either. But I know we worked on just fundraising campaigns and things like that too, which anybody can get in on that sort of thing as long as they're willing.
Absolutely, and that's the key. As you also, there are some guys and gals that are really good at writing proposals for funding, much better than a biologist. So, and that helps bring money in. And there, some folks are really good at negotiation and talking to the local politicians. A lot of other folks aren't. So, all those skill sets are valuable to an organization. And if you want a voice, having a voice not just as an individual, but a voice to a local chapter or an organization magnifies your voice as well. So you can move these yardsticks forward. One of the big challenges we have right now is we have I'm pooping on our boys in Queens Park right now, but they don't want to listen. They don't want to listen to anybody that says, "Sir, isn't there another way?" They want to hear that. They've frozen a lot of folks out, and that's one of the reasons why there's such frustration amongst the conservation and environmental groups, because they can't even have a reasonable conversation with these folks to say, "We could do it better if you want to listen to us." They've already made up their mind, so that's a challenge. And the only way to get at it like that is to consolidate your resources and start to engage those that you would not normally associate with. Your neighbor might be a staunch conservative. Talk to him. Is this a really conservative thing to do, or is this something else that we don't know what to mean for what they're doing? Because conservatives used to be the staunch guys with fish and wildlife. They were the ones that set up the really good laws for protecting fish and wildlife in the past, healthy environmental regulations. Bill Davis's government was really did a really good work on environmental regulations to better protect rivers, lakes, streams, and wetlands. These guys are not conservatives. Matter of fact, my mother, who's 95, her good friend Matt has been a staunch PC guy ever since I was a kid and knew him. He doesn't vote PC anymore. He says, I don't know what they are, but they're not conservatives. So I don't know what these guys are, but they need to be, people need to talk to them clearly as a group. And the best way to deal with politicians like that is you start to align yourself with other organizations that don't necessarily share your direct interest, but have a common interest. People love hiking, they should be involved with us. If they care about clean water and healthy water supply, they should be involved with us. So in other words, you're getting different sectors of society. When multiple sectors of society are yelling and screaming at a politician, they listen because they can't discount you as a fringe anymore. You're now becoming mainstream, which means they have to deal with you. So those are the things that a bunch of folks are trying to do right now, is consolidate and bring folks from different perspectives together with a common interest in making government work better for everybody, not a few developers.
Yeah, that's great insight. Definitely.
Well, I just want to go fishing.
Don't we all? Under 3 weeks today.
Yeah. Oh God, yes. Well, I think I'm going to be invited to do a walk and talk about restoration work on Cold Creek out near Brighton. So that's where I'll be.
Very nice.
Yeah, it should be fun.
Yeah. Well, you're very kind with your time. Thanks for spending the evening with us, and thanks everyone for tuning in for this. If you want to get involved with stuff, Trout Unlimited has a great website. It's very easy to get involved, but you can reach out to us at the shop too. We have contacts, people like Jack, if you want to talk to anybody about how you can help. So hope everyone finds some time to get involved, or at least maybe donate this coming year.
It adds to the pleasure of your sport. It did for me, and it still does for me.
Yeah. You meet some good folks, and frankly, you learn how to fish better too once you start understanding rivers better.